November 6th or 10th or whatever, we'll put a stone on the shirt. Send it out there.
So we were in one of the two maxed out. It was just, so it was like it was still off, but not. Yeah, like we turned it down.
Maybe not.
Good morning, everyone. We go ahead and get started. It's a very important day for the Global Executive PhD program and certainly a great day for Mark Colosimo. Mark started his Global Executive PhD program back in 2010. And
thought we were going to tell them that.
But prior to joining us, Mark got his bachelor's in chemical engineering from University of Michigan back in 1997, and started with urban science in 2001. And since that time, he basically also obtained a master's degree as well as an MBA along the way. And over the years, he has gained a lot of domain knowledge around automotive dealerships and operations management and analytics. He's currently the global director for data and analytics. He is joined by many of his colleagues here from urban science and certainly by his family, Nancy and the two kids, Nathan and Sierra. And very excited. So in terms of the process, Mark will take 45 minutes or so to basically present his material. He can take clarification questions during the presentation, but you can hold your questions, any technical questions, till the end of the presentation. And then the audience will be allowed to ask questions. And once the audience is done with questions, the audience will be will leave the room so that the committee can continue the discussions. And then, in terms of the break, you can walk to the outside area and enjoy the view, I guess, when the committee is continuing the questions. With that, Mark, go ahead and start the break.
Thank you, Dr. Chittum, and good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thanks to all of you for coming today. As Dr. Chittum mentioned, this has been a long process, and I appreciate all those that have been involved throughout it, through the encouragement, through the asking me if I'm done yet, through the other questions I've gotten over time. I greatly appreciate all of you being here and all that everybody's done along the way. I do want to start with acknowledgments. I know we typically do this at the end, but I did want to start which is acknowledging some folks that were heavily involved through the process. Obviously, the folks that are listed up here, my committee members, starting with Dr. Chittum. Many revisions, many discussions, lots of time that we spent on this to make sure the wording was right and that everything was covered, as well as his leadership for the GET program. I don't know if many of you know about that, but this is the Global Executive Track PhD program. Obviously, most people traditionally do a PhD right after they finish their undergraduate and usually their master's graduate studies, go right into a PhD. This program was designed for professionals, people that were already in the workforce, already experienced out there, and could apply it not only in the classroom, but then hopefully also to some of the analysis they provided along the way. So thank you for your support, and thank you for all the work that we've done together. Leslie's on the phone here. Thank you for leading the department and keeping this going, this program. He's given me a lot of input and got me prepared for this as well, and I appreciate his help. Tony helped us get this room, which is fantastic. She also taught us the quantitative and qualitative analysis way back, oh my gosh, it was a long time ago I took that class. But she inspired me to do what you're going to see in the qualitative section from the analysis perspective today, so thank you for that. Jim Anderson, my mentor, my supporter, my instructor as well, even at Urban Science as well. He's taught me so much along the way, and I appreciate all his help. Actually, he helped me start this process. He was looking at Urban Science to have a PhD, and he asked our Human Resources Department to look into that, and someone asked me, do I know anybody that might be interested in getting their PhD? And went home, talked to my wife, talked to the family. They told me, absolutely don't do that. No, they didn't say that. They said, go ahead if you want. You know, it's going to be tough. I just finished my master's 5 or 6 years before, but decided to take this journey and see how it went. And it was a long one, but it was a fruitful one. So thank you, Jim. And Reinhard Fischer, who I hope is joined in, or was potentially going to be here today. He opened his brand to us to basically do some of this research. And it's tough for a lot of the automotive manufacturers to do that, to want to do that, to be able to access to their dealerships, dealership personnel, and I appreciate his help and support in being able to do that, as well as his input on the analysis as well. Of course, my family, Nancy, Nathan, Sierra, always there for me. Thank you for waiting. You know, you've always given me the encouragement to get it done. When is it going to get done? I appreciate that. That kept me focused. That kept me thinking about what I need to do next in order to be able to achieve this. And I appreciate all your help. And this taught the kids as well. Never quit. Never quit. There's always a way, and to keep trying, eventually we'll find that way. And also, always keep learning, right? Because the learning hasn't stopped. Here I'm 42 years old, and we're still learning. My parents, who are on the phone today, they told me my job was going to school back in the day. My mom was to clean the house, she was a stay-at-home mom, and my dad was to go to work every day. That's what I was told when I was a kid. Well, I think I'm kind of finishing my job a little bit here. I guess I got to find a new one somewhere. But thanks for all your love and support as well throughout the process. And of course, my Urban Science family here today, a lot of representatives. Appreciate it, especially Randy Berlin might be on the phone. Dave Creech helped me a lot on the early end of this as we were doing some analysis with a major dealer group here in the United States. And finally, all my friends, thank you for coming today. Thank you for being part of this. Awesome to see you out here. And thanks for your support. So let's get started on the actual material here. So here's what we're going to talk about today. First of all, we're going to talk about the motivation for doing this. Why did I decide to pursue this? What is the point? What was the value? And eventually we'll talk about the results. So we'll first talk about an overview of the research. So where did this come from? What are some of the bases in literature that this was generated from? We'll then talk about quantitative analysis first. Quantitative is, as you can imagine, quantities, numbers. So this is analyzing data, and this is analyzing data that generally exists in our automotive world. And really, we're applying this, as we go through this, also to other retail spaces as well, because I think a lot of the same analysis that we've done here could apply to any franchisee type model. Then we'll talk about qualitative analysis. This has to do with, as you can envision, quality. So that will be more of an assessment of things that aren't as concrete, aren't as discrete in nature. And finally, we'll end with some contributions and conclusions around our practical insights that we found, future research that we can do, as well as our contribution to literature and research. All right, so starting with the motivation. So a lot of industries have embraced data analytics, but not a lot in the automotive space. I think it applies to retail in a lot of ways. You've heard of things out there in banking. We talk about digital media, digital marketing a lot, and the analytics that are being done there. So you look at Google and you see that there's these couple ads that you see at the top. Those were bought, and there was analytics behind deciding to put those there. As I look out the window as well and see Little Caesars Arena, I think of sports as well. Who's seen the movie Moneyball? A lot of you. Movie Moneyball I'd like to say I'm Brad Pitt out of that movie. I'm more the Jonah Hill, unfortunately. But Jonah Hill goes out, he creates this algorithm that helped them identify who are the best targets to bring on the Oakland Athletics, because the Oakland Athletics were in trouble at the time from a franchise standpoint relative to being able to turn a profit, but they needed to fill seats. So how are they going to do that? Well, Brad Pitt, in the movie, decides to go with some of the analytics that Jonah did to eventually apply that to making those selections. Because typically you have a room like this with a bunch of guys talking about their experiences and what they thought were the right things to do. But in the end, they ended up going with that and ended up being very successful. And now teams like the Red Wings, like the Pistons, all have analytics teams on them to do this sort of work, even at the college level, to do this sort of analysis. So how can we apply this to automotive as well, especially with all the data that we have? Dealerships have a lot of commonly used processes out there that they believe is the right thing to do, but unfortunately a lot of that hasn't been vetted thoroughly, analytically. It's just accepted norms that we typically see out there, especially with the consultants that come in as well. It's based on their things that they've seen, their experiences, rather than being concrete data-driven results. Dashboards and performance scorecards are shown throughout the literature as something that businesses should rely on. Dashboards are, as you can envision, dashboard of your car, are basically the display of certain metrics at a given point in time. Scorecards are, like you'd expect, a report card, like a summary of all of those metrics. And this is heavily provided in the literature about a lot of research, what to include, but a lot is very high level and very basic. And even in the automotive industry, it has been seen that there are a lot of these components that exist out there, but they don't necessarily provide the value that they should. One challenge that the automotive space does come across is the difficulty to obtain some of the data, particularly in the granularity needed to be able to do some of the research I'm talking about. So ideally, we can get into some of the details within the dealer systems, get all the data from the manufacturers that they have, but that can be hard to get a hold of, especially with a lot of it being very well paired, especially at the dealership level. So talking more about the motivation, dealership profitability actually has been dropping. That's surprising to many people. You think the economy is great, just saw the unemployment statistic come out here recently. It's at the lowest in 49 years or something like that. But dealership profitability has not been increasing throughout this period. So the danger there is that these dealerships are actually running a lower profit than even say 2010. And if we go into a recession, we're going to have a problem, right? We're going to be selling as many units. And therefore, they're not going to be able to handle the expense structure that they have today to be able to turn the profit that they need. And even relative to the economy, they often say that, and this is in the literature as well, that the new vehicle sales kind of leads the economy. So if we can look at that metric, we see that we've actually potentially peaked here recently. We've kind of flattened out. And actually this year, I think, is currently projected. I was reading something yesterday, might be less than last year. So that being said, are we down a little bit here, despite the fact that the economy is doing well? Dealers need to be ready. Also to note, dealerships make a lot of money servicing parts, not in selling new vehicles. Not many people know that or understand that. But the greatest profitability, the guides I saw in the literature as far as typical numbers on service, is a profit of 73%. And you're saying, no surprise, when I go into a dealership, that's why it costs so much. Well, maybe a little bit, but we won't get into that discussion. But on the new vehicle side, it's only about 5%. So that's a substantial difference. That's a goal. A lot of dealerships don't actually obtain that. So our problem of practice is trying to help dealers who do not know how to improve performance through all of their data that they have, be able to do so. There's so much out there, and I have a little prop here today to give you an example. This is what was called the Ford 1984 report. Okay, can you guys see it in the back? Very well. Yes. This was, by the way, on a typical 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And it is also, front and back. These are what field representatives use to go out and talk to dealers about on a regular basis. You can see there's all kinds of little notes on here about what to say or what to review. How, with all of this, can you make decisions, or can you find the little nugget that is the right thing to do right now? Our proposal is that with our analytical process here that we're going to talk about, that there is a way. There is a way to take that and get to those few things that are the most important. And what we want to find is the overlap of what matters and what can be controlled. So, just like in our lives, there's a lot of things that we think matter that probably don't. So we've got to figure out what really does matter for our end objectives. And then we've got to figure out what we can actually control. Because if we can't control it, why worry about it? There's also a conflict between dealers and manufacturers. So I'm going to use, by the way, the term OEM that refers to the manufacturer today, just for clarification. But what we've found is that there's a consistent conflict between the objectives of both sides. It's not just everyone wants to sell a lot of cars. As I just explained to you, service is where dealerships make a lot of profit. Well, how does that help them? Well, they sell more parts that way, I guess genuine parts. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they sell more new vehicles, which is what the manufacturers are obviously trying to do. And we'd like to get to a point where we're at a win-win state. So what do I mean by a win-win state? That means that both sides, the dealers and the manufacturers, have achieved their goals. We'll talk more about that later. So in the literature, we found some gaps. First of all, business analytics discussed for decades, but seldomly in automotive. We really didn't find much literature that applied to the automotive space when it came down to this topic. And when I say business analytics, by the way, I'm talking about that making decisions based on data, the data science piece. Also, effective analytics-driven processes for selection and management of KPIs, again, hadn't been strongly researched in the retail space. We did find stuff that was relevant to customers, to employees, a lot of survey-based stuff, but nonetheless, there was not a lot about how to run the retail operation. There's also a lack of case studies surrounding it. So how to utilize these key performance indicators, another acronym I'll use. We have quite a few of them that we'll talk about today, but KPIs, or key performance indicators, where those are typically managed, but there's not a lot about how this has actually been utilized to achieve end goals. Also, retail outlet analysis has not been addressed for automotive dealerships in the literature that we looked at. They have a lot of data, but there's not a lot of analysis behind that, and we think a lot of that's due to the fact that that data is not readily available, not easily accessible. In-dealership activities and emotional factors are not addressed. So this gets back to automotive again, but it's also true for a lot of retail. It's like the individual processes. How do we apply those processes, or find within all those processes what are the most important in order to be successful? And as I mentioned, most of the analysis really is about customers, and it's not the business itself with their cultures, their attitudes, but rather satisfaction, pricing, discrimination, all different pieces that we found in the literature review that we did. And again, the struggle between the manufacturer and the retailer. Again, not a lot about that was mentioned in a couple cases that were mentioned particularly here, but overall there wasn't a lot of literature that referred to that issue, because that is something that is very strongly in automotive that probably doesn't exist as much in a lot of industries and in all retail spaces, but there are quite a few out there that it could apply to. So our research question here is, how can dealers use data-driven analytics to manage their key performance outcomes, another acronym for you, and what qualitative factors play a role in affecting observed outcomes? Okay, does that make sense to everyone? So what are our goals here overall? First of all, we want to come up with an effective methodology. We want to understand what that process of analysis is. Because it's fine having data, but the data might change at any given point in time. We want to be able to apply this elsewhere also in retail. So how do we do that unless we have a process that we can follow? Also, being able to take a large number of KPIs to make KPDs that are linked to the KPOs, okay? So the KPIs, again, are the indicators, so key performance indicators. That sounds like an obvious thing that must be important, but the challenge is that they're not all key. They're really just performance indicators. What we're suggesting is that you get to a point where you have figured out which are the real drivers performance. That's where KPD comes from, key performance driver, that relates to our KPOs, key performance outcomes. We want to follow a process also to identify questions for interviews that will eventually result in a survey. Talk about that in detail. And then we'll identify the constructs that relate to this. The constructs are basically an accumulation of these questions into groups, factors, that function together, that act together, and provide some insight into the actions that should be taken in order to impact those KPOs. And then finally, being able to provide actionable recommendations. All right, so the research overview. So first of all, we'll talk about the quantitative side, and we'll get into more detail in a minute. So our goal is really to guide dealers in the direction of what are these factors to improve? Where should I focus all my attention? Again, they're very busy people. If you've ever been in a dealership, which I assume most of us have, it's a very busy place. There's a lot of activity going on, and a lot of these folks are trying to typically put out fires, I think, from the interviews and discussions that we have, rather than focused on data analysis. So the process kind of works overall that we start with, and this is our model of how it functions, from kind of the customer deciding what to do all the way to actually purchasing a vehicle. So we start with attraction. Promotion and incentives can cause that. Inventory can count that. A published price can cause that. That might attract you. Then you have contact. You eventually have to call the dealership, talk to the dealership, see if they have our inventory that we want, and figure out a price. We can also obviously interact with their website to understand what inventory they have and what's involved with that. Then we interact further through actually identifying the actual inventory, the selling price, and the value proposition when we're actually sitting there in the dealership. Some of this we can do outside, but then when we actually are looking to finally purchase the vehicle, you still have to go and get it somehow. And then we make a decision whether or not we're going to sell the car or buy the car. The key is, for our analysis, that we need to be able to benchmark. And in having that need to be able to benchmark, you need robust data. So the challenge is, if I go to one outlet, one dealership in this case, I can't do a robust analysis. That's what a lot of consultants actually do out there. And granted, they apply their experience, but still, they don't necessarily have that robust data to do all the analysis they need to do. In our case, what we're able to do is accumulate a bunch of data to be able to do analysis so that we have a big enough sample to work with in order to provide results. On the qualitative side, something called concurrent triangulation design is what we use. This really, in summary, is taking interviews and surveys iteratively to figure out what are the right questions to ask and mixing that with quantitative data. So our quantitative data in our qualitative analysis were the outcomes of that profitability and that sales performance. So we're trying to figure out what qualitative things relate to that. I say, again, quality is a little bit subjective. It's survey-based results. It's not as discrete as I made $500 last week. Then we'll do interviews and surveys. So why are we doing that? First of all, figuring out what to interview about, which would eventually relate to what we survey about, was a process. And we'll talk about that process. But based on the literature that we could find, the process of being able to go out, talk to experts, talk to industry leaders, talk to dealerships, and understand first of all, their used to new sales ratio was low compared to the benchmark, and they were low on sales personnel. Okay? So there were a lot of issues, obviously, that could relate to this potential issue of having only 68% sales performance. So as you can imagine, the recommendation addressed these areas of opportunity. So increasing traffic through advertising or more efficient marketing, could be the quantity or the quality of that effort. Increasing inventory, selling more used once you sell more new, because we need to sell more new first. We don't want to say sell more used because that's not necessarily going to help this number. It's only new vehicles that we're talking about there. And then adding salespeople as well. All right, so in summary on the quantitative analysis, I got to speed things up. Applying existing methods to automotive retail, reduce the amount of content that dealers, again, need to look at. Identify what are the KPDs to manage, focus their attention on certain things because they are so busy. We try to balance OEM and dealer goals. This will also arm the field personnel with scientific results that they can go out. There's a whole field organization that calls on dealers on a regular basis. They go out and visit dealerships from the manufacturer, and they try to help the dealers, try to wholesale vehicles to them. And this gives them more meaningful information that they can use in order to help their dealerships be successful. And then the OEMs can also understand what applies to their dealerships as far as getting the improvements they want to see. All right, on the qualitative side, first of all, our methodology. We did interviews with automotive retail experts. This was heavily covered in literature, that there are many cases where people go out and do expert interviews to start the process of understanding the industry and understanding what some of the concerns and challenges are, as well as where those variances existed between how different locations, different people operate them. So our first phase was to go out and just say, hey, I'm interviewing you in this semi-structured interview where I'm going to sit down with you and try to understand as much as I can about your business and what you do in order to try to make change, to make difference. And also ask you questions about some of your operational characteristics. From that, we're able to come up with a more consistent approach to the interviews. So we did 17 to start, then we were able to follow that up with 18 interviews that we know we're going to ask you, and we're going to follow this structure here. We also relied on manufacturer, headquarters, and field personnel to identify those objectives that they thought were important. So that's where this comes from relative to the sales effectiveness and profitability that we've discussed. Then we're able to create a survey. Again, finding areas of variance in what we were being told as far as the way dealerships operate. Culture, I'll give you an example, was one thing that from the very beginning, phase one, a lot of dealerships brought up. It's the culture of this place that makes us good or bad. Well, what does that mean? That's where we have to rely on the literature to look into what questions can be asked about those types of things in order to be able to ask questions properly in the survey. So we distributed our survey starting in March 2017, closed in 2017 July. We used a 5-point scale. We had 139 questions. And we got responses from 42 general managers, owners, and managers, their department managers that were going to be general managers. But we didn't keep it to just certain brands. We didn't keep it to just certain market types. So they could be urban, rural, whatever. But we wanted to identify what were the factors that related overall to the result. We wanted to parse this down. Again, we have 139 questions. How do we get that into something meaningful that we can do something with? Because that's a lot of questions. I'm thankful that they were able to complete a 139 question survey to begin with. But that was great to get that data and be able to analyze, to eventually get to the point where we're able to figure out of these factors, what are the most significant for driving our key performance outcomes. So here's a little background on the folks that we surveyed. So their years of employment. Through the gamut here, kind of covered everything. You can look up there, I'll go through this fairly quickly. The years that they've been employed at any dealership, again, there's some very experienced people, some less experienced people. What were those locations like? Some were suburban, urban, rural, fairly well distributed. And then their role. Most of them were general managers, but we did get some owners, and then some other managers, which again, were going to be general managers eventually. So here's our conceptual model. This is based on all of the research that we did to understand what might be the factors that relate to our KPOs. So again, we've talked about sales and profitability. We also considered loyalty as we first started doing some of this research. The challenge with loyalty is measuring it. What does that exactly mean, and how in the data can you actually figure out whether or not an individual is loyal, especially when we have multiple vehicles in every garage across the country for the most part, where it's hard to figure out if which one you're replacing at any given point in time. I just bought vehicles for my children, for example. Was that replacing one of my vehicles or not? They may not be able to tell in the data, and therefore it's a little muddy trying to figure out loyalty. But there are ways to do that. And these are kind of quantitative outcomes here. These are different factors, different pieces of how management functions with people within the dealership processes, and we're trying to figure out of all of this, how that relates to these outcomes. And this was our first take, our first assessment of where we thought this would go. Of course, our analysis will provide something that's more concrete here in a minute. So the operational areas that we reviewed: marketing, inventory, price, selling approach. Performance and processes. Just understanding both on what we call fixed operations, which is really the back end of the dealership, service and parts, as well as variable operations, which are the front end, which are new and used sales. Again, that culture piece. And then understanding those attitude and perception. So we relied heavily on literature in order to figure out what questions to ask here. We don't want to just go through a bunch of questions out there to make it. We asked a few relative to specific processes that we gleaned from the interviews that were different ways to do things. For instance, having a sales to service handoff process. And what I mean by that is, did the salesperson take you back to the service department and say, hey, here's your service advisor that you're going to come see when you bring your car in for service next time, and maybe even set a first appointment. That would be a sales. Some dealerships do that, some dealerships do not. And then there's a lot that are in between. So that was an area of variance that we saw we wanted to ask about. And these were concepts that we learned that vary amongst dealerships, and then we relied on the literature to come up with the questions. So our results: we generated factors through principal component analysis. We considered 6 through 15 factors. Here's an example on the right here of one of the factors that end up being called internal culture. You can see that there are a variety of entries here. These are all questions that were asked. So again, we're trying to take all of these questions and pare it down into a discrete number of factors that we can manage and work with. And our goal was to have above a value of 0.6 to be included as a factor for any of these individual questions. And some of them are positive, some of them are negative. I know it's really small. Some are positive and some are negative, meaning that they have a positive or negative relationship with our key performance outcomes. For instance, at the top here, the dealership lacks a team spirit. Well, that's a negative thing, right? So if we're going to have it have a positive influence, you'd actually have to change the words around to be in the opposite direction from a sign standpoint of that value. So we ended up finding an 8-factor solution. We needed to increase the iterations for convergence relative to our principal components analysis. Again, we only had 42 respondents, which was good enough. Let's do the analysis, but we would like to have a lot more. And 71 out of 135 of the questions actually ended up in these factors. So you can see that just for this factor alone, there were a large sum that fit into just this one. Analyzing these factors now to identify how good they are as a group or individually here at trying to provide some sort of result. Again, we're just grouping factors at this point. So it's their relationships of these questions to one another that as a group they tell us something, okay, that we're trying to figure out. We came up with 8 of them, as I mentioned. Again, look for the loading range over 0.6, which is true for all. So you can see how many questions were included in each of these factors. We also look at something called scale reliability. Again, trying to figure out, did these things matter? Did they make sense as a group to be together? And then, cumulatively, what is their ability to explain variance? And in our case, these 8 factors explained 76% of the variance that occurred in our outcomes. Also, we want to make sure that these factors don't overlap. They don't correlate amongst themselves. So if we found a value over 0.7 in this matrix of comparing all of the factors against one another, we'd be concerned, and thankfully we have a couple that are a little higher at 0.6, but none over 0.7. And this was our resulting model. So we pared it down and kept it simple in the standpoint that these 8 areas, these 8 factors that we came up with through the principal components, all potentially relate to our 2 objectives that we were focused on, our sales performance and our profitability, and the win-win zone for dealerships. So relative to the regression that we did, understanding factor performance, first of all, we wanted to now see, we have these 8 factors, are they any good? Do they tell us anything? We found as factor 5, first of all, was a little weak. We wanted this to be, this variable importance to be about 0.8, but that one was a little bit short. As we applied it specifically to evaluating return on sales and sales effectiveness, the relationship with return on sales and sales effectiveness, we wanted it to be, again, over 0.8, and we're now looking at it by those individual relationships. So that was in combination, this is separately. And again, factor 5, not very important relative to our statistical analysis of its relationships. But everything else looked pretty good Everything else looked great.
Can you briefly comment on the factors, Mark, if people are not able to read from the back?
Okay.
On the previous slide, you had a good picture. Yes.
Okay. So okay, I mentioned internal culture. So it had to do with things that are going on in the dealership, how people felt about how they worked with customers, how employees worked with one another, how management worked with employees, trying to get an understanding of how individuals reacted and worked together within the dealership. Operational processes were more concrete things. Do I do this? As I mentioned, the sales to service handoff example. Decision making. One of the questions there that comes to mind was revolving around, is it centralized or do we keep the employees engaged in making decisions? So is it all at the top or is it amongst the whole dealership that we get everybody involved? Internal communication. Do we consistently talk amongst one another? Do we allow people to have interaction across departments? Customer orientation. Again, how much time do we spend with people and to what degree? How focused are we on making them happy? What do we do with them? What is our general feeling about handling and dealing with them? Dealership management. These are again their perceptions about their employees as well as how they did things operationally. Risk propensity or innovation. How often are we likely to try new things? Are we willing to try something different in the dealership to see if that works? And then a sales and marketing focus. Do we spend a lot of time marketing? How do we do that? What are some of our main areas that we do focus on to be able to get the word out about what we're doing, and how quickly do we react to certain things in the marketplace? Okay, so I grayed out 5 because we were a little worried about factor number 5. Also, you might see here some negatives. That means that they're negatively related. So the opposite is true from what you'll see, okay? There's a negative relationship for 2 and 4. So these are the coefficients. This is a coefficient plot here. We're looking at a blue line, which is the sales performance, and the red line is profitability. And we want to see what the impact of each factor is on those 2 items. Because once we understand that, and if it's important to any degree, then we can suggest that if you're deficient in one of those areas and need to improve, that we could then focus on one of those factors and we could look at the questions in more detail potentially with the dealer to figure out what we could make change upon. So factor 5, we'll ignore that one for now. But you see factor 8, huge impact on sales performance, but a negative impact. This line is the 0 point. A negative impact on profitability. So for sales and marketing focus, that has a large positive impact on sales performance, but a negative impact on profitability when people answered that question to the positive. Okay? And note as well that it's very unlikely in any of these situations, for any of these factors, where blue and red are on the same side of the line. Which tells us that relative to these factors that we're looking at, they all impact those 2 things in an opposite fashion for the most part. There's some that are close to the line, for instance with factor 3 here, and factor 7, actually they are both sides of the line, but very small impact on profitability when that's positive for risk propensity. Okay, so that being said, when we get back to our win-win and the workings together of the manufacturers and the dealers, you can imagine they have an opposite impact by doing any of these. So how do you then balance your efforts to make sure that you're impacting both in the right direction to get to that win-win area? Break this down further. These are all the individual factors here on the left. There's 16 rows here because now they're assigned each and looking for their relationship with each of the outcomes of sales performance and the return on sales. So what we're trying to find here, taking this a step further, we looked at variable importance, but now we want to see statistically is there a relationship with the outcomes that we'd expect. And you can see for instance, dealership operational processes, which is factor 2, we ended up with these p-values, which is a statistical measurement. When it's over 0.05, we typically say that there's not a relationship, or it's uncertain that there's a relationship, or unlikely to be a relationship. So what we'd say in those cases is that the hypothesis of the relationship would not be supported in situations where that p-value is over 0.05. So you can see that there's a few in here. Again, 5 came up again, which we were not surprised about, and then 7 in its relationship to profitability. But 2 was surprised, that one overall for both sales price profitability, not a great relationship there with our outcomes. So as we look at each individual factors, what are they telling us? So we did all this work. We had these 8 factors. What are they telling us? First of all, internal culture. Good team spirit and committed employees help the bottom line ownership, but not necessarily sales. Okay, remember, a lot of these are going to do things for one and not the other, between sales and profitability. Factor 2, again, is a little weak from a statistical perspective. But factor 2 tells us that dealerships are less likely to be innovative and risk-taking, are less connected, tend to have profitability. That's okay, but not great sales performance. Factor 3 and 6, by the way, dealers are better at using data, are better at generating a superior profitability level. Dealers that are good at internal communications have better sales performance. Those that have greater innovation have lower sales performance but better profitability. And dealers that know their sales targets, focus on them, know their market, again, do well from a sales or do not do as well from a sales performance perspective compared to having high profitability. So each of these have an impact in different ways in many cases. And this assessment allows you to be able to understand where if a dealership is deficient, what they could do to change. So as we do a case study, here's our dealership example. 78% sales effective and above average return on sales. So what can we do to improve? Well, first of all, looking at the survey results for this dealership. Lower than average for factors 1, 5, and 8, and higher for 2, 3, 4, and 6. And what does that tell us? We go back to this plot again. We can see that 1, 5, and 8, where they're low, negatively impacts, that is for 1, and, well, for 1, that would negatively impact sales performance, but 8 would positively impact sales performance. And given that they're low, you look at number 8, especially with its high impact on sales performance, and say, well, if that has a large impact and you're low, maybe that's what's causing your sales performance shortfall. So we might want to look at that one first. And they're higher than average for 2, 3, 4, and 6. So if you look at 2, 3, 4, and 6, we're then not surprised that they have above average profitability, where the red line is always above the 0 line. So for them, some recommendations. Survey responses that support a strong positive impact on profitability were the internal culture, the interdepartmental connectedness, centralization of decision-making was occurring, speed of decision-making, but they had a lack of career management, okay? That's not good, probably, right? For sales performance, but it does help profitability. So you gotta think about what it's impacting, because remember, a lot of these things go in opposite directions. And finally, they had limited free pickup and delivery service. Again, that would help profitability because they're spending less money on it, but I'm not selling as many vehicles and they're not attracting people to me. Things that relate to weak new vehicle sales. They don't have a family-like dealership atmosphere. Again, a question that said, hey, if you have a good atmosphere at your dealership, that will promote sales. They don't. Via the questions that were asked, therefore, we associate that with the weak new vehicle sales. Individuals across departments didn't talk. They had deficient discussion, debate to make decisions, minimum data usage to make decisions. They were very cautious on innovativeness, and they had an inability to easily trade for vehicles. So in summary, for the qualitative study, we find that dealerships that follow the practice that we consider ideal, like those things that just make sense, we found that they're better on a sales performance side, but not a profitability side. Dealerships that use their skills for managing their businesses and profitability, which may include areas outside of new vehicle sales, obviously do better from a profitability perspective. Imagine service, if I'm focused on that, I'm going to do well from a profitability standpoint. To use data, if you're familiar with the data, analyze the data on a regular basis, we found that that has a impact of higher sales performance, but not necessarily profitability. Those that are innovative supports profitability, but not sales. So I try new things, and that helps me get more profit, but not more new vehicle sales. Dealerships focus on customers and employees, following typical guidelines. We're able to achieve those new vehicle sales targets, but profitability may suffer. And again, culture was something that came up quite often. Our conclusions and contributions. So finishing up here, our practical insights. First of all, our quantitative process, more or less summarizing what we just talked about. We're using a large amount of data, a large volume of data to help make decisions for a business. We have that conflict we have to manage relative to the KPOs that we talked about. And the qualitative analysis looked at things that the data that we get normally does not provide us any insight into. The interviews and surveys helped us provide recommendations. As we saw, those two lines tend to oppose. So how can we manage that then, relative to those 8 factors, in order to improve the area where we might not be performing very well? And we understand their impact on both sales and profits. So our remarks, the analysis provided, I think, can be used not only in automotive but other retail. Anywhere you have this type of relationship. Now, this win-win thing, relative to automotive, I think, is something that obviously through all the interviews and all the work we did, we found to be a substantial thing. I think by industry we'd have to evaluate that, but I think this could apply elsewhere. Again, the actions may have opposing impacts, so we need to understand the balance that we need. And then there's a lot more additional research that can be done as we went through this. Conference presentation, we've had opportunity to actually throw this out there in front of others, particularly at the Informs Conference last November, even through the Archdiocese of Detroit at a presentation earlier this year, trying to apply this to churches. Who would have thought, right? And then our experiences beyond some of those conference presentations. Also, I was able to attend the National Association of National Automotive Dealers Association. You're messing me up. National Automotive Dealers Association. I was able to attend their dealer academy last year and understand how a general manager would actually do their job and understand all the nuances of that, which really helped in the research as well. And then we're looking to submit. We currently have 1 work under revision, and then we'll be submitting more relative to these journals to hopefully be published. So other future research opportunities, there's really a lot of them. I've really condensed this down because we could be here for another hour just talking about those, I think. More thoroughly understand the win-win dealers. How do they get there? Where do they come from? How does that happen? On the quantitative analysis, we assume that the variables were linear in nature for the most part, but may not be in real life. In other words, as you maybe increase a certain quantity of something, maybe there's a diminishing return at some point. We'd have to analyze in more detail. More comprehensive data, we get transaction level data. Again, that DMS data that exists out there. It'd be great to get more detail how that works. Other departments, as you can imagine, we focused on new vehicle sales performance. Our focus was on management alone. And understanding from their perspective, given that they're making the decisions. But yes, there very much could be variance. That could be an additional piece of research as well that we actually talked about a bit early on, was relative to surveying some of the employees, salespeople especially, service writers, and understanding some of their perspectives as well. But I think when you would get to that, you would have to start piecing this together. It'd be a big puzzle of understanding of how all these individual people in different roles impact the overall outcomes of the dealership. But again, we wanted to focus on those at the top that were most directly impacting that. But yes, additional research could be done in any of those veins, any of those groups of people. I mean, you have salespeople, you have the finance and insurance folks, you have service writers, you have technicians. There's a variety of different roles that you could address, or departments you could address to try to see what their opinions and thoughts are as well.
Any thoughts on your factor 5 that was customer focused negatively impacting sales?
So it wasn't strong, don't forget that. Statistically, we had to put that aside.
Very good.
But yeah, again, what does that impact sales? I don't know, so I have to look at the questions again. Generally speaking, again, if it's not statistically mattering, I mean, we kind of ignored that. But yeah, there's any number, again, getting into the individual questions, we have to examine that to see what, and we can do that. What are some of those factors that might relate relative to how does this impact sales from the way the question was actually asked? Because a lot of that, these are, again, contracts, these are accumulated factors together that are trying to say something, but it's a general term relative to that, and yes, it should have a positive impact, you think, on some of these things, but if it does impact profitability positively, maybe that's to get folks to come into service. I don't know, along, down the road where they have a bad experience, then it doesn't, and therefore it's a negative impact on one versus the other. We'd have to examine that in more detail.
So I have a question about your takeaways. You did a lot of analytics, and you've been in the business, so you had a lot of intuition coming into this. You know that there's a lot of consultants out there, like you mentioned. So what's the takeaway that you would say, hey, that's an insight that we analyzed that really wasn't intuitive, but based on your research and your analytics, is a new takeaway to this dealer measurement process that you can say, now that's new, that's unique, that's something that is a result of my research. What's the insight?
Very good question. Yeah, it's funny, as you mentioned, experience. I think Dr. Chim and I had many discussions about applying experience to this process. And again, as I mentioned throughout, a lot of this is based upon, taking the literature and things that exist and be able to expound upon that and look at things in a different light. What I personally learned that I thought was very interesting, I think, is really that qualitative piece where we have all these factors that are opposing in nature. And here we are consistently trying to balance both the manufacturer and the dealership's perspectives and goals, and it's clearly very difficult. I think we've effectively proven that it should be difficult because these things are so different. And we already know from the quantitative side that dealerships, for instance, as we bring up inventory, don't necessarily want to hold the amounts that we would be recommending sometimes, and that's a challenge for them. Experience with one of the dealerships that we researched, eventually could persuade one to increase inventory, but it took a lot of arm twisting in order for them to get to that point. So I think it's just a better realization of there's a lot of work to do to be able to kind of smooth over how both sides need to work together. I think it's a great opportunity as well. That's why I have a lot of future research opportunities here also, as to be able to better understand that and be able to dig in deeper to be able to provide even more insights to both sides. Yes, sir.
Two small questions. One, what was your metric for inventory? Was it turnover or unit levels?
So we used days supply originally, and we looked at that and we showed you the two charts at the bottom of the slides. Day supply is the common industry metric, which again is basically I have 30 units and I sell one a day, therefore I have 30 days supply. That's how long it would take for me to run out if I didn't get any more.
Okay.
We looked at days supply relative to the expected amount of sales you should have. So that days supply metric, the first one I mentioned, was relative to my current sales rate. So I normally sell one a day. But what if I'm supposed to sell two a day?
Right.
Well, then you only have 15 days supply in that case. 30 divided by 2 in that case, my 2 that you are supposed to sell.
So
each
it
day.
is volume adjusted.
Right, based upon expectations, not actual.
Okay. And then, did you stratify your analysis across any type of product mix or, car category like luxury versus?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, there were various brands involved. One thing I did mention earlier is that relative to these performance metrics is that there's a process that exists to come up with them, the sales effectiveness metric, that takes into account, in order to come up with this expected number of sales, a segment adjustment process. So it looks at the popularity in any given area of certain segments. For instance, in Alaska, you're not going to sell a lot of convertibles, right? So if I use some average that says, national average of what percentage of my sales should be convertibles, obviously it would be low in Alaska compared to a national average, but then in Florida, it would be high. Well, I've got to be able to adjust for that and to know that. Similarly, in New York versus Texas, New York's going to not have a lot of pickup trucks, but Texas, we know they do. So we've got to be able to adjust for that difference. That's where that expectation value comes from in NAR6. So yes, we do take those factors into account when we look at different brands, and there were different brands included in the analysis. Other questions?
How do you take into account salesperson turnover in your analysis?
Salesperson turnover. So we were just looking at quantity at a given point in time. The source of that data was financial statements, which is always the best. Data quality is always a challenge with any of this type of analysis. But it's generally down the right pathway. So Analyzing that data did provide us some insight. We couldn't look at specific turnover. If we were to do the analysis, the hypothesis of analysis would be to more specifically understand when people are actually in dealerships, working there, to be able to quantify that over a period of time as people come and go, being able to look at by day, even potentially if that data was available, get a better sum of the capacity of the dealership. But turnover, yes. Does that have an impact? It could or could not. And that's another tough part of salesperson. It gets to the quality of the salespeople, in talking about their experience, in talking about their understanding of their market, understanding if they have what we call a book of business or not, if they have a bunch of clients from the past that they can call upon. All questions that we'd love to ask and get data on, and if we had that, we'd provide a lot more insight into the individuals and be able to come up with better analysis in that space. Questions? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell how long it would take a dealership to turn their sales effectiveness around or the profitability given your method? Is that, is there a general?
About 2 days. That's a lie. No, that's not true. Yeah, I mean, ideally, it would be great to go. I think, again, future research would tell that through applying this over and over and over and over again to see how impactful the changes are. Again, the first thing is these dealers have to accept that they're deficient in these areas and may change. The example I just gave relative to one dealership that was examined, again, the arm twisting had to occur over 6 to 8 months to say, hey, this is your problem, hey, this is your problem, hey, this is your problem, and even actually act upon it. That's step one. And then step two is to be able to actually see what impact that had on the operation as a whole or these certain metrics. And it's, from where you are, your market, everything is different. The people that you're working with, they just explained to Mr. Phillips, relative to the personnel that are there. Are they able to handle a situation? Do you have more inventory? Are the personnel experienced enough to be able to handle that? Maybe there are enough of them, but maybe they're not of good enough quality to be able to get the job done. So there's so many moving parts, and we're trying to just refine that down to obviously some low-hanging fruit through the analysis. But I think that would take a lot of individual case-by-case assessments to figure out some timing impacts. And it'd be great to do that.
Mark, do you see an opportunity to look at consumer satisfaction in the future, marrying this data, whether it's at service or it's at new car?
Yeah, consumer satisfaction data would be great to understand better and feel and incorporate. Through research I've done in the past, we found that the actual surveys that are provided don't always provide a lot of insight due to the fact that rewards are provided. So, as many of you may have experienced either on the sales or service side, either the salesperson or the service provider might say, hey, you're going to get a survey, or back in the day, let's pretend like I was using paper, but I realized that we don't do it via paper anymore. You're going to get a survey, and you need to fill this out and give me the highest score because that's how I effectively get paid. I'm not going to say that, but that's true. They're paid through their pay plans in many cases. As we talk to many of these dealerships based upon those CSI scores that come in. So it would have to be something divorced from that. That's the only way you're gonna get a lot of good relationship, I think, there, is to be able to understand truly, and maybe it just requires more detail. I don't know what the exact mechanism is, but you'd have to have another one rather than the way that they do things today to be able to get data that's of any use, of any insight. We have seen, however, through some data analysis that over certain values of satisfaction, that they have a greater propensity to perform better in certain ways relative to certain key performance outcomes. But it's not a guarantee. So whether that's anything or not, I'm not really sure. And I don't know that plays a big role in this other than to say, here's maybe a level that's the minimum that a manufacturer could use in order to suggest to their dealers they need to be over that to have a good impact on the customers.
Nathan, Sierra, any questions?
Seriously, you got nothing?
Can I drive the car?
All right. If that's required for this, then I'm.
Okay. So please excuse us, and you can you know, go to the balcony.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for not falling asleep. Thank you.